Hello to all of you. I would like to warmly welcome you to the Center for American Progress. My name is Winnie Stackelberg, and I'm the Executive Vice President of External Affairs here. As we open our event, all of us at CAP extend heartfelt, deep and profound sympathies to the families of victims and everyone who has been impacted by Orlando's tragic events over the weekend. This tragedy, like others before it, has led some to call for America to close her doors to the world, to turn away from the huddled masses seeking a better life, and to question the allegiance of those already here who may not look, speak, or pray like them. But this is the wrong lesson to draw, because what it means to be American is not defined by birth or bloodline, color, or creed. It's about participating in our democracy and contributing to our society and building new opportunities for ourselves, our communities, and our families. And that's what refugees are doing every day. Today we release a new report entitled Refugee Integration in the United States by Silva Mathema in partnership with David Kallick and the Fiscal Institute of New York. The release of this report is timely, not just because people across the world will celebrate World Refugee Day this Monday, June 20th, but more importantly because the world is currently facing one of the largest refugee crises in our lifetimes. According to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the worldwide population of refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced people has reached a record high of around 60 million persons, a level not seen in recent history. Historically, the United States has been a leader in responding to the humanitarian needs of the world through refugee resettlement. But when they do find a place to call home in the United States, as our new report indicates, these newcomers quickly become self-sufficient, thrive in their new communities, and in the process contribute to the well-being of their local economies. In light of the ongoing humanitarian situations in Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, and Congo, and elsewhere around the globe, there is a great and urgent need for the United States and other nations to do more. The U.S. promised to admit at least 10,000 Syrian refugees in fiscal year 2016, as part of an overall goal of admitting 85,000 refugees from around the world. But more than halfway through the year, we have only resettled around 3,800 refugees from Syria, although we are ramping up efforts to resettle more. In comparison to other countries, such as Germany and Canada, who have stepped up their efforts and opened their doors to tens of thousands, or in the case of Germany, hundreds of thousands of uprooted families from Syria, and provided them a safe haven to rebuild their lives. Many more Syrian refugees are living in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. While Syrian resettlement is a matter of global importance today, the need to find durable solutions is no less great for other refugees around the world, many of whom have been waiting for years or even decades to be resettled safely. This is not the time to pull back on our efforts, but rather it is an opportunity to lead by example and give those from around the world who have nowhere to go a chance to build a new life. The results of our report validate a pattern that we have long observed in the immigrant community writ large. Over time, refugees in the United States successfully integrate in their communities in a variety of ways. They participate in the labor force, overcome the language barrier, start new businesses, become citizens, and flourish. We have brought together a remarkable panel today to discuss refugee resettlement and integration in the United States. And please join me in welcoming to the stage Mayor Tim Mahoney of Fargo, North Dakota, David Disegard-Kallick of the Fiscal Policy Institute, Suzanne Kuzuri of HIAS, and Augustin Nabaganyamana of the Maryland Office for Refugees and Asylees, and CAP's own Silva Mathema. We look forward to hearing their thoughts and provocative discussion and hearing questions from our audience. Silva, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. And to those who are watching online, thank you too as well. And thank you, Winnie, for kindly welcoming us and our panel on this day. To add to Winnie's remark, you can access the full report online at www.americanprogress.org. And if you'd like to post online on social media, which we would really appreciate that you do, you can use the hashtag #WithRefugees. So we have a lot to discuss today. So let me just start by introducing our panel to you. To my right, we have Susan Kuzuri. She has worked for years in refugee resettlement issues and is a senior vice president for HIAS, one of the major refugee resettlement agencies in the US. Then we are joined by David Disegard-Kallick. He's the author of the report and is a senior fellow at the Fiscal Policy Institute in New York, and where he also directs their immigration research initiative. And we are very honored to join by Mayor Tim Mahoney of Fargo, North Dakota. He has been a mayor of Fargo since 2015 and is a vocal and a very strong supporter of refugee. Lastly, we have Augustine Nabaganyamana he's the director of the Office of Refugees and Asylees for the state of Maryland. And he has also worked a lot in this field, as well as he's also a former refugee from Rwanda. So we are very, very excited to have all of you on this panel today. Let me just start off with David, actually, because we are releasing this report today. So why don't you tell us more, briefly about the report and also the key conclusions that we need to keep in mind throughout the discussions that we're going to have and probably take with us today as well.
Sure, thanks. Refugees come to the United States from some of the most horrific places, situations in the world, and we admit them out of humanitarian reasons, of course. But it's reassuring also to know that when they come, they do well in the economy and they help our country to grow. So we've seen, as refugees come in the report, we see that they learn English, right? They get jobs, they start businesses, they buy homes, and they become citizens over time. This becomes even more true as you look at the differential between what happens when they first come and the long term. And so this report is kind of exciting because we developed a methodology to be able to look at what happens to immigrants, to refugees over the long term. As you may know, we have good data about refugees when they first come into the country. They're carefully vetted, and we have administrative data about where they go. But our government surveys don't generally ask about immigration status after after you've arrived. And so what we did is we looked at the census, and we identified and the Census Bureau data, like the American Community Survey, and we identified 4 refugee groups. So we looked at Somalis, Bosnians, Burmese, and Hmong. And those are all groups that are primarily made up of refugees, and so we're able to then use the census data to look at how they're doing when they've been here for a longer time. And what we see is they do much better over the long term. They become well integrated. In terms of wages, they go from starting out around $20,000 a year as a typical wage for these groups to $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year after they've been here for 10 years. They shift in occupations so that whereas in the beginning about 20% are typically in white-collar jobs, for example, by the time they've been here for 10 years, that's more like 40 or even 60% in white-collar jobs. And we see with English that people who've been here for 10 years, for over 10 years, tend to speak English at least well. The large majority speak at least well, and many speak very well, or even at home speak only English. Just say a little bit about the regional differences in the country, because so refugees are about 8% of immigrants overall, so it's a relatively small part of the overall picture of immigration. But there's some parts of the country where refugees are playing a particularly prominent role. So you can see in cities like Utica, New York or in Minneapolis or St. Paul, in St. Louis or in Lewiston, Maine, places where there's been a decline in the population often of the city, and refugees are part of a kind of revitalization of the downtown areas, and that's been, I think, a very positive thing for them. We see in farming areas, Wisconsin and Minnesota, for example, where Hmong and Burmese especially have been really dominant, actually, in some of the farmers markets and in revitalizing the family farming that's going on there. And then there's some places where we've seen overall growth in the city, as well as refugees playing a part of that kind of expansion. So I'm not going to say anything about Fargo, North Dakota, because I'm sitting next to the mayor. But I'll turn it over to you and to him to talk about that some.
Sure, Mayor, and that's a really great segue. Thank you for opening that up for me. But can you tell us more about Fargo, especially in regards to refugees that Fargo has welcomed?
For many of you may have seen the movie Fargo. We're not the movie Fargo. But our city is growing over the last 10, 15 years, and we have a metro area of 235,000. In the next 5 years, we'll have 30,000 jobs available. And we have a great growing city, good economics, and things are happening. We have been bringing refugees in, about 500 a year have been coming into our community. And we have found them an important part of our workforce. So the number one priority as a mayor was workforce development when I came on. And I've been a commissioner for 12 years as well. So I've watched this migration of what's happening, what makes things happen. And we've been blessed. Our refugees have come in and brought a lot of things to our community, education, culture, food, religions, different things that happen. It was interesting, there were some things against Muslims, so they opened the mosque, and all these people came to the mosque, and they said, this is just like a Lutheran social. They have food available, and you walk in and you have religion, and it was just very nice because people got exposed to a different type of life that was very important to them. But we've been very happy about this. Our diversity in 2002 is about 2%. Our diversity now is 11%. So our city is making a very keen effort to become urbanized and change as we do that. And our new Americans are an important part of our structure and work with us very much all the time. I was in middle school the other day teaching some 12 and 13 years old. And I was struck, a young man raised his hand and he said, Mayor Mahoney, when is life not so hard? And it struck me a little bit. He was in our town living and doing things, but how could I make it easier for him when we're welcoming? So our goal as a city is to be a welcoming city and to continue to grow in that manner. And I hope you'll be happy by the end of the year. But thank you.
Yes, and we would definitely like to listen more about Fargo and the exciting things you are probably doing there that works. Maybe I'll shift a little bit and think more about the refugee resettlement issues. Susan, you've worked in this space for such a long time. What role do you think refugee resettlement agency like HIAS has on resettling? And more importantly, since we're talking about integration, integrating them into the local communities.
So, HIAS, can you hear me? Did I drop my...
There
Can you hear
go.
me now?
Yep.
Okay. I think it's working, yes?
I have to flip it around, otherwise you don't hear your clothes.
Try moving. Augustine, you could have answered as well, but...
Yeah, that was my second.
All right. So refugee resettlement in America is a public-private partnership. The public part is really important, but I'll just preface with a couple of things. So refugee resettlement is not a new thing in the United States. My own organization, HIAS, has been around for 135 years, and refugee resettlement has been going on that long. Back then, we were in Ellis Island on the docks helping refugees who were coming in, at that time mostly Jewish refugees fleeing Tsarist Russia as back as 1880, and we did some of the things that we do right now. And HIAS wasn't the only one. We're probably the oldest of the resettlement agencies, but we helped people arrive. We gave them food immediately when they came in. We checked how they were, their medical situation. We checked to see if they have family in the United States. We made sure they had all the right legal papers when they arrived. And then for those who had relatives in America, we would give them a bus ticket to go join their relatives. And from back then, the theme of American refugee resettlement was employment.
That was my family, I have to say.
Was employment. And so employment, employment, employment from way back then, and that continues to be the theme today. And so we were talking about how much things have changed, but at the same time, things haven't changed that much. There are 9 resettlement agencies who have a contract with State Department. So when refugees arrive in the US, we all have networks around the country that help resettle refugees. All of our contracts are quite similar. Basically, first of all, it's very important that we're spread across the country, that we have national scope, because the idea is not to ever impact any one community. And in order to really create welcoming environment, welcoming communities, you want communities that can absorb refugees coming in. So that's a really important piece of the work. It's very, very, very important to create welcoming communities, and that's where the public-private piece comes in. So while we have money from State Department for the first 30, 60, 90 days to help people get kids registered in school, help get people Social Security cards, as the mayor said, refugees, we keep saying they're refugees, but they're actually new Americans, because the US government overseas has already identified that these people are of humanitarian concern to the US, and they will have the right to work and residency status within a year of coming here, and citizenship status, if they choose it, within 5 years. So they really are new Americans. And when we call people refugees, it's almost like saying they're aliens. They're not. They're new Americans. So basically, first 30, 60, 90 days, we help with their cultural orientation, get kids to school, make sure people know what 911 is, what social services are available, etc. So we're there at the port of entry, so to speak, all over the country, all 9 agencies, the Catholics, the Lutherans, the Evangelicals, International Rescue Committee, U.S. Committee for Refugees, a number of the agencies, some of them who've been around for historical reasons. We all do the same work. We all have affiliates around the country who work with state, city, local officials to do this work. Once our piece is done, the federal government also gives money to the city and the states through something called the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. And that's where the funding stream goes for employment contracts through partners in the city. It could be us, it could be other partners, ESL classes, medical assistance, and I think that's where, after us, Augustine's piece comes in.
Right, so that's great. So let me get your thoughts here as well. You've worked with the refugee resettlement agencies, but you're with the state now. What do you think the role of the state is in resettling, as well as integrating refugees that come to your state?
Right. Thank you very much again. I commend the Center for American Progress for publishing this report. I think, having been in the field of resettlement for quite some time, I know it was overdue, and I'm quite happy with the outcome of the findings. So at the state level, again, we get funding from the federal government, and the role of and so in my office I serve as the state refugee coordinator. And the role of state refugee coordinators is to, number one, administer federal refugee assistance. And so with that, we cover anything from transitional cash assistance, and I put emphasis on transitional cash assistance because the goal of that transitional cash assistance is to make sure that refugees have a means to meet immediate financial needs while learning English and getting ready to search and obtain hopefully well-paying jobs. We also pay for English classes, and so every refugee state coordinator has funding to pay for refugees to have access to English language training. That is also extremely important because in my experience, refugees who speak English tend to go to work faster after arrival. And obviously, the overall integration, because if you can communicate with your neighbors, if you can, you're able to express your needs if you're ever in need. Communicate with teachers. You overall, if you speak the language, there's just a lot of things. It does open up a lot of doors, and so we make sure that every refugee who comes in and does not speak English has access to English language training. We also pay for refugee medical assistance. So every refugee who comes in may access temporary medical assistance, and then once they start working, they can access medical assistance through employment. And if for whatever reason they can't work right away, they can apply for regular Medicaid because it is something that they have access to as legal residents in the U.S. We also, fund obviously case management, and case management is really to connect people to mainstream resources. As a new arrival, there's a lot of things that you need in order to start life from the scratch. How do I register again kids in public schools? What do I do if I was ever in an emergency? So community orientation is part of our efforts locally. Another role that we play at the state level is to capacity building for local agencies. I'm fortunate to be in a state where it is diverse. 14% of the Maryland's population is foreign-born, and so my work is kind of cut out. But depending on where you are in the country, state refugee coordinators also help educate other state agencies, local agencies on how to work with refugees. And actually, it doesn't have to be even government agencies; it could be private agencies as well. If you're a local public health, local hospital, are you equipped to work with a patient who doesn't speak English? And how do you? And so that's something we do again locally.
Thank you. So maybe we should shift gears a little bit and go deeper into the issues of integration and how to actually get there. David, maybe you can set this up a little bit. We know that in the report you look at different refugee groups. How do they? What does the research tell us about their integration in the local communities?
Well, I think so. You see, in general, I think the overall trend is very strong, and in I think every instance moves in the right direction. Certainly, some advance more quickly than others in some ways, and so you see, in terms of English language, for example, Somalis do particularly well. In terms of home ownership, they do not as well. Burmese do very well in the professions like being doctors, lawyers, engineers, and actually also in executive kind of jobs. So that's actually very interesting to see the big jump that they make from when they first come to afterwards. I think there's a lot of, one very interesting story I would say is about women working. In a lot of cases, refugees come from cultures where women are not often working very much in the paid labor force. And so you see in 3 of the 4 groups we looked at, when they first came, women's labor force participation rates were relatively low compared to the US-born women, but that by the time they'd been here for 10 years, they were all at the same level or higher than US-born women. So I think that was actually, there were a number of things like that that are just interesting nuances to see in an overall picture where, I think the overall story is tremendously positive, and it's kind of the American story.
Right.
Can I just add one thing? So
Sure.
David's story is about fast forwarding what happens to communities over time, right? I think it's important for people to know that a lot of the refugees who come will come for humanitarian reasons, but a big percentage of them come to join family members. And so when we talk about public-private partnership, the private part is synagogues, churches, volunteers, university students, all getting involved in this, and organizations like mine making sure that when people come to local communities, there is a host of people who are welcoming them when they come in, because that's very, very key to integration. If the local population isn't welcoming you, then your experience isn't going to be the same thing. So across the board, we're all involved in community engagement.
Right.
That's absolutely key. And family members are a big piece of this. So those who come to join family members play a big role in what I was telling you in the beginning. We help set up, make sure that they have apartments they can afford with low-paying jobs, etc. I'll also tell you that in America, our resettlement model is one that all over the world they're looking at, because the emphasis of our model is independence and self-reliance. And so while Augustine was talking to you about transitional assistance, etc., both the refugees who are resilient and who never wanted to be in the position that they're in, but one day in their lives everything changed and they had to flee, and all of us who work with them, the whole point is to keep them off assistance and get them as part of the community. So I just wanted to make
Right.
those.
That was actually the next question that I was going to ask. So thank you for that. But we just maybe each of one of you can give us an example about the type of programs or initiatives that the state took, or the city took, or the Refugee Resettlement Agency took, that works. That gets to the key point where the need is the most. So if you could tell us more a little bit about that.
I can start. So in Maryland, I think one of the things Maryland is sort of unique again, and I worked in the different states in the refugee resettlement. We see a higher number of special immigrant visa holders. Those are from Iraq and Afghanistan. And then we also see a huge number of asylees. We serve nearly 1,500 asylees a year, which is like 1/3 of the refugee population that come into the state every year. And so, for whatever reason, again, we have a very highly skilled immigrant population. And one of the things that we've been looking at more recently is looking at, how can we as a community leverage the skills that immigrants come with to meet local workforce needs. Again, we have people who are trained in healthcare, who are refugees and immigrants. Locally, we have workforce shortages in healthcare. We have shortages in STEM careers. We have refugees who are very good in math and well trained in the STEM fields. And so, again, that is something that we just embarked on, and we continue to again, we have a task force that's looking at those kind of things. And again, I think that's something that other communities can replicate and look at, because you create a win-win situation where you accelerating integration for the new arrivals, while the business community is happy that they can meet their workforce needs. So I think that's important. We do have school programs where by obviously we want to in the efforts to build capacity for local schools so that they're better equipped to work with foreign-born students. But equally important, I think, is recognizing what those immigrants or refugees bring to the local school districts. And so we hold events to celebrate different cultures. We get we have groups like American and refugee groups that have formed to address diversity at the local level, and again, that's something that can really be replicated anywhere where refugee students are integrating in the community. Like I said, we fund different refugee programs, and employment is, I would say, for me, it is the backbone of the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. Again, having come to the U.S. as a refugee, I thought, gosh, learning English would be the hardest thing that I would have to do. it turned out to be the easiest, really, because once I started working within 24 days after arrival, and once I got into work, really everything else came naturally. And I started learning English. I was forced to because I was working with Americans. Integrating culturally, the good and the bad. So, I learned to drink iced coffee.
That's important.
Well, drive through, those kind of things. But most important, and to never cook ever again. But most importantly, I think I formed a community of friends again, because I think what really came the hardest and surprisingly was within the 24 days that I wasn't working, feeling sort of isolated. I was resettled in New Hampshire, of all places, and it was a great community. I really learned a lot. I feel like I grew up in New Hampshire, and it was a great community. But having said that, it's a rural state where everybody hops in their car, they go to work, they come back home. So if you're a new arrival and you are the only person walking in the street, that can be isolating. And going to work really was, it was awesome for me, and I haven't stopped. So I think really working for me is a priority as a state refugee coordinator, and I think any refugee would say that that's probably one of the biggest things on their to-do list when they come in.
Thank you so much for sharing that. But Mayor Mahoney, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about some of the programs that Fargo has
Well,
done.
Lutheran Social Services brings our refugees in, but we have a healthy competition between our businesses. So I have 33 businesses that are vying for refugees. So you will see them very vigorously trying to attract refugees to work for them. So you wouldn't sit for 24 days. They'll come right in and try to get you employed because they find that you come to work on time and they come to work. We're trying some programs with free bus passes so they can get around the community. Our educational system is very dedicated and very committed to this as well for English speaking. So we have a special school in which we do English speaking, but we try to make that a community center as well so that people can gather together, learn English, but also get together. 40% of our children are refugees, or 40% of the refugees are children, so we try to set up things to make them welcome. In our police force, we have a liaison officer, Christy, who is very non-threatening and kind of works with the different people because some of them had a different experience with police. So it's very important that we can have them integrate and feel comfortable to come to us for problems and things that go on. I think we have a healthy dialogue in the community, and we have a healthy competition because workforce is the one thing we're really looking for. And sometimes what happens, we have a little competition with other areas because of climate. I guess some people don't like cold weather, but we have to have a little bit of that. But what happens is if you have a job and you're working and raising your family and feel welcome, we have many people that come to our area. Many people migrate actually to Fargo now because their families have come as refugees, and we're seeing a growth of diversity in the community. So we're very happy to have this part of our community.
That's great. And just to plug into that, I know, the impact of refugee communities is sometimes felt more often and more strongly in small communities and their local economies. So, David, have you seen anything like that in other cities as well that you can talk about?
Sure. So, Mayor Mahoney is talking about a situation where you have economic growth and population growth, and refugees are helping to make that more vibrant and diverse, right? I think it's also interesting to see the places like Utica, New York, or Lewiston, Maine, where small cities where they've had this history of population decline, and refugees are being placed there, and there's the agreement to take them there, partly because they want to stem that decline and try to reverse it. And so I think you've seen that succeed in some ways in places. Minneapolis and St. Paul and in Philadelphia, where refugees are part of a larger picture of immigration, but have been in the initial stages, key to, I think, making the central cities in those areas feel more interesting. And that's part of the economic impact is, of course, more people, more jobs, more consumption, the economy grows in that way. Business owners often play a very important role, and especially small businesses that are not necessarily big businesses. And I would say that sometimes the main economic impact is the effect on the neighborhood and the central city, rather than necessarily just directly how many people they're employing. So you see people start grocery stores, right? And in fact, it's partly because they find that there's food that they have a community there, and there's food that people may be interested in. But it's not too long often. I come from New York City, before the hipsters discover it or some new, decide that that's actually really kind of an interesting place to go and shop, or restaurants, of course, classic. Also, what we called Main Street businesses in a different report, sort of looking at, so restaurants, grocery stores, beauty salons, dry cleaners, the kind of stuff that, and in some of these cities, what you see is that there were population declines, and so there were downtown areas that started to be boarded up. Also, the shopping was done more in the suburbs, in the big shopping malls. So you had downtown areas that were boarded up, but that made them, so that took them off the tax rolls. It made it also not a really great place to live because there was no place to shop around and there weren't people on the street. Now you see this trend, and I know you've seen some of this in Fargo also, of interest in being in the central city area, that it's very attractive to the young cultural creative classes, or people who are who want to be in a city, and they want to be in a diverse city where there's something happening, in the evenings, on the weekends, where there are interesting places to go and shop, and I think that's very much the kind of picture that you see refugees together with other immigrants playing in all kinds of cities.
Yes, just going back to the programs and initiatives, I want to give a chance for you to respond as well.
Okay, I'll say one thing. So workforce, of course, is really important. Working with business is important, and so it's important to be creative, right? We do things, a lot of our agencies, where we might have a staff person who's positioned at an employer's to help for people who don't speak the language. I mean, there's lots of nice nuances, but what I would say is the refugee program has beautiful moments every single day, and that part is lost in the news. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of amazing things when people touch people. And I would say the program is more about hand up, not handouts to refugees. And the moments are precious. So my organization, for example, has Jewish roots, and I would say local integration is really, really key. And not long ago, when we heard all about what was going on with the media, about fear, about the Syrians. So for example, we have a monk in the San Francisco area who called us up and said he has a beautiful retreat, and they want to open the doors to whomever is coming and support us. So it's full of moments like that. Our organization also works very closely overseas, and then also when they come here with LGBTI refugees who are not accepted in their own communities and not accepted in some of the host communities where they go. And our offices make these connections with LGBTI communities here to receive them and accept them and help them with jobs and acculturation. And just, it's a soft, gentle landing for them. I think it's important that you know that when refugees are placed in your communities, we don't just do a lottery and throw them there. There's a lot of thought about this person comes from a city, this person's a professional, maybe I want to put them in a city, and the idea is not to let them feel isolated. And let's put them in a place where they'll be received, or where if they have an IT degree, they can get a job in IT. If they're a big family, I remember working for the Lutherans and going to North Dakota, and believe it or not, I wished I lived in North Dakota at the time, and I went there at negative 23 degrees. But there's amazing things when you see a church opening its door to a family of a family of 15 of Kurdish people. Those are really the amazing stories of what makes it special, is when the host community receives these people. And the stories really, really are beautiful. And what we're trying to do in terms of, as the organizations that do this work, is really to highlight those moments and give voices to what refugees do in their lives, in the business area, but just in enriching culture, but also who they are.
Right, that's very beautiful, actually. So we also need to think about some of the challenges, and we have touched upon it a little bit. How does a city like Fargo deal with some of the challenges they might face during refugee resettlement and integration? And that same question, for goes to a refugee or a refugee resettlement organization. So maybe start with the city.
I think the biggest thing you fight is fear. So I think people, not knowing the unknown, have images or ideas of what somebody might be. So oftentimes what we do is put pictures out of who refugees are, just so they know they shouldn't be fearful. And I think the biggest thing sometimes people will say, well, they'll take the job away from me. No, they're not taking your job. We have other jobs for people to do. And in fact, if you want this job, you can have it as well. But you have to get rid of some of the rumors and fear that get out there. And we did have a reporter that started to get into that. And we had a beautiful thing happen because our director of Lutheran Social Services was fighting back and trying to say, here's our refugees are important, here's what's happened in our community. And our newspaper voted her a Person of the Year because of her stand on refugees and how she was doing with that. And what that really meant is the community was standing behind her. They felt very strongly that this is something that we need to do as a community. And we actually saw a resurgence of people, and when you talk about churches are taking on things, are taking on challenges. So for us, I think it's been a healthy discussion we've had, but oftentimes if you don't give the facts or tell people what's really going on, they get filled with a fear factor, this is going to happen, or we're going to have ISIS come in the community. There's just so many different rumors that get out there, and how are we properly vetted, how the refugees are brought over, what goes on into that. So we had a lot of education we put out there, so people were much more comfortable as we go forward. And I think that's part of what the challenges are right now in the refugee programs, is people aren't sure who's coming, and the first thing somebody says, let's shut the borders, and let's not do that. And the problem I have is we have a lot of talented people in our community I'd like to keep, and they can't get a card, or they can't get to become an immigrant. So it's really a difficult task, I think, as a country we have to start looking at. We are a melting pot. We do accept people from all over the world. Shouldn't we get back to that?
So that's very interesting. Are there any, do you organize some type of events so that you can bring communities together, or I guess the cultural liaison
we had an
officer?
event which we invited all the new Americans and people in the community to a dinner. We had a dinner, and then we had multiple different foods served. And we had a great turnout for that, and people discovered a lot of different things that go on. And whether it's drinking tea, which some people don't drink in our community, learn how to drink tea and learn different cultural things that go on. And we found it more of the challenge is to try to get people more and more involved. So we openly invite the people to an event and try to have days in which that happens. And we've found that we have a lot of people in the community come and learn about a culture or learn about people. We have gardens, so we've started to do some gardening with people. So a lot of our new refugees will have a garden and learn how to share. So that's shared within the community they live in the neighborhood they're in. And it's hard to get that discipline of waiting till tomatoes right to pick. You have to teach people how to do a garden. But it's opened up our farmers market. And we have a lot more things going in the farmers market than we ever had before. But people get used to that daily types of interactions. And we find the more interactions we have within our community, the healthier it becomes.
Yeah, that's great. And just to pivot a little bit and think more about the challenges that the refugees themselves face, what do you think are the major ones that are, that there's probably a short-term one that the refugees face when they come in, but what are the more long-term ones that linger on even after they stay here for a few more years? And
maybe I could say about that. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems the refugees face is the same kind of problem that everybody else in our economy faces, which is the incredible polarization of the economy, and the fact that there are a lot of very low-paying jobs that don't lead to higher-paying jobs. So part of what we see as we look in this report is the same sort of wage gap that is basically the wage gap within the American economy. So you see people doing as well as U.S.-born, but that's not necessarily doing so well, right? And I think that that's part of the overall problem. And I think, what do you do about that? I think obviously there are a whole series of things, and I know other departments here at CAP have proposals, and we have as well. But I think that in order to politically move those forward, you need to avoid the kind of divisiveness that says, it's about them taking our jobs, and instead say, actually, we're both in the same boat together, trying to figure out how do we make some progress in making the economy work for everyone.
yeah, would you like to add to that, Augustine?
If I can piggyback on something you said, when I was doing employment, workforce development at the local level, we used to joke that refugees could be a measure on how well the local economy was doing, because we knew when things was going south and we knew when things were picking up. It was just like that, without looking at any stats. And the reason I mention that is that refugees, there might be some unique challenges to refugees, but for the most part, I think refugees highlight existing weaknesses in our systems. An example that I can give to you, I mean, I think the challenge that I see right now is the economic landscape that has really kind of shifted from having, in some areas, having heavy manufacturing, to now all those jobs have moved overseas, like simply not in existence, or if they're existent, they're more like require higher skill, they're more like skilled labor types. Again, so refugees coming in have to require much more training. If they don't already trained in a specific field, it just requires much more training and resources to get them up to where they need to be in order to secure those jobs. But is that a refugee issue, or is it a community issue? Because they are dislocated workers at the local level that need the same types of interventions that refugees need. The cost of housing, in Maryland and many other communities as well, it is a problem for refugees. But again, is that a refugee issue, or is just a larger community issue? When you speak to many, even middle-class families, they will say, the rent is simply not affordable, and so I think it is very important that when while refugees, because again, it's a topic of du jour, and people want to talk about scapegoat refugees, I think it's very important that we really try to broaden our thinking in terms of what does issues related to refugees teach us about on communities in terms of what we can do to improve? Because again, if it's housing, if it's unemployment, or social integration, it's in most communities, refugees make up a small fraction of what the larger immigrant populations are. So I think it's very important that people frame things correctly.
Yes, thank you. And Susan, would you like to add?
No, I mean, I totally agree with them that this is the top tier area of challenges. But there's, of course, family challenges. So I'll give you one example. When I came to America, and I came with my grandmother in a refugee situation and then was an asylee for a long time, the first big shocking thing is this is the person that raised me. I was orphaned earlier on, and this was the strongest woman I knew in my life. And we arrived in the United States, and all of a sudden she became illiterate, even though she spoke 4 languages. And all of a sudden I was the one who had to lead us through the airport because I could read and write English and French. She spoke French beautifully. She spoke Arabic. She spoke Farsi, she spoke Hebrew, she spoke other languages, but she couldn't write in Latin script. And those are a lot of things that refugee families go through. Husbands and wives, all of a sudden your wife is being encouraged to work and other people are telling her what to do or what a good family life looks like. I saw a Nepalese family in Pittsburgh who told us that they were so embarrassed to have their little temple in the house near the kids because they were trying to be better Americans. And I was there with a number of our board members, and actually every board member from my organization who was there had been a refugee themselves, one from Hungary, each one from a different place. And all of us said, don't be embarrassed about keeping your culture. Your strength comes in respecting and remembering your culture and bringing it with you. You enrich us as a result. So I seem like I'm the one who keeps bringing the soft issues, but those are things that people go through all the time.
Augustine, you've already mentioned some of the challenges you met when you were here. Were there anything that worked for you?
Absolutely, but before I get to that,
You're going okay.
I have to ask.
Yes, indeed. I just wanted to mention something that I've been thinking about for a long time. I think we correctly frame the U.S. Refugee Settlement Program as a humanitarian program, which it is, and that is really important. But for someone who doesn't care about humanitarian as getting involved in internationally, I think it's very important we also bring in another important discussion, which is, why is the U.S. Resettlement program is a good policy decision. I think we have mayors and many examples of where refugees have helped rebuild cities that were crumbling down. Whether it's Baltimore City, Utica, New York. I know Chicago is going through that process right now. Fargo and other places, and I think we really need to that is a message I think that resonates even more than the humanitarian aspect of the resettlement program, the humanitarian aspect of the program, and so I think as a community, it is very important for us to figure out how we get that message across, so that resettlement. The program isn't always discussed in terms of, people coming over and taking jobs and other things, because again, I think the other side is vocal, and I think we need to make sure that we talk about the positives. Like, what do refugees add to local communities, whether it's social, economic, and other areas as well. So I think the question you asked me was, what works for me. So I arrived in March 2000, and I was resettled in New Hampshire. That was after 6 years in refugee camps in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and spent some time, 13 months in the detention center as well, just for being Rwandan. And so, really coming here, I was both excited and nervous. Excited because I was no longer under the threat of violence, but nervous because I was going in a community that I don't know, have no friends, I knew no one. Again, I thought the language was going to be the biggest barrier. It turns out not to be not as bad as I had thought. Clearly, because I did not speak any English when I arrived. I think really, what worked for me is the seeing very welcoming communities. And I think, to this day, I guess I've never seen people as welcoming as Americans. I've lived in Democratic Republic of Congo. I lived in, West Africa. It was very great to see the welcoming spirit of the American people. I had people who, wanted to invite me to, their dinners, and people who, I had a guy who wanted to adopt me. I knew I wanted to be independent, but the fact that he offered was really significant to me. And then, I have, a teacher who really went out of her way outside of the classroom, giving me books to read and essays to write, making sure that I was ultimately going to go to college, because I had told her that was, a desire of mine. A GED teacher who, she's figured out how to order an English, French GED test from Canada, because I had failed English reading and comprehension, part of the U.S. test. A lot of people say, I'm doing my job, but to me, that was beyond doing their jobs, and that really that worked. And I think the more as communities, we're welcoming, the more we invest in our newcomers, and hopefully, you see the fruits afterwards. And again, I think, I'm one of many thousands of examples, I think, as your report indicates. And yeah, so again, I think what worked for me is really having a welcoming community.
Thank you so much for sharing that too, and that's a good segue for the next question. And we're at a crossroads right now. Winnie mentioned, about the global refugee crisis, and just thinking about the report and how, right now, people, when they talk about refugee resettlement, they think that, oh, refugees will not integrate, they will not be a contributing members of the society. But this report, shows otherwise. They do integrate over time, and it's actually very positive. So in light of that finding, what do you think communities should do concerning the global refugee crisis we are in right now?
Well, I can say one thing, I guess, which is I think they should relax. I think we do see that refugees over time do well. And I think we also should have some perspective. There is this record number, as Winnie was saying. We're at a time when there is record level of displacement around the world. The United States, though, has not significantly changed the number of refugees that it's taken. We're not really in that kind of crisis or in that sort of different situation here. Maybe we should be taking more, and of course there's some political discussion of whether we should be taking some more, but we're talking about at the level of about 80,000, 85,000 a year. Maybe it should be 10,000 more than that, in a context where there are 60 million people around the world. So I don't think that there's necessarily a direct connection between those two things. I think we can relax and say, and feel some confidence, right, that the United States is a place where we've done this a lot and we're pretty good at it. And it's a strength for us, both economically and I think in other ways, but not that we're facing the kind of crisis that I would say is happening in Turkey, in Germany, in Lebanon. That's not really what we're talking about here.
We're almost out of time, but Mayor Susan, would you like to add to that?
First?
Oh, go ahead.
So I'm in agreement with you. So we talked when we were alone about the fact that the numbers we're seeing now aren't unprecedented, nor are they that big. After 9/11, the numbers really came down, the numbers that the U.S. was admitting. So they came down to from about 110, 120,000 to 40,000, a screeching halt. And all these security clearances that you're all reading about really started at that time. But the U.S. traditionally, before 1980, was always bringing in refugees, but it was reacting to the moment. It was reacting to the crisis. So there was a Hungarian crisis, and they said we opened doors for Hungarians. Irish, we bring in the Irish. The Jews will bring in the Jews. And so it was specific to groups. And after 1980, there was a decision to bring in a varied amount from places where people were being persecuted, but also places that America thought was in its foreign policy interests to allow those people to come in. So during the Cold War, it was virtually from any country, any communist country, you would just go to Western Europe and say, I want to be a refugee, and America said, come on in, you're welcome. And so foreign policy and refugee resettlement was connected to all these things. In 1980s, we can say that maybe it was being more professionalized, more fair, but these numbers aren't numbers that our communities can't do. We've done them in all our lifetimes. And so I would just say that I agree, but there's so much fear right now. And there's also fear on the side of the refugees thinking we're not wanted in America. We're afraid. We're reading the news. We're watching TV. We're getting the text. And it sounds scary to us to come here.
Mayor Mahoney, would you like to add? And then
Well,
we
I
can
just
open.
think, imagine any one of us, if I had to stay 5 years before I could go somewhere else. Why do I have to stay 5 years? I mean, we're all kind of a now society. If you're a good person, what would make you have to stay somewhere 5 years? And our numbers are pathetically small compared to the rest of the world of how many refugees were coming in. And we have a parade in the summertime, and my new Americans stand out all the time. They're as proud as any Americans, hold the American flag up high, and they're very proud to be part of it. And I just think we have to rethink some of this, is that can you imagine being persecuted for religion, faith, whatever, and not allowed to move on? And then when they come in, they resettle. They move into your society, they become part of your citizens, and it's a very powerful voting bloc in our community. I mean, when people get out and vote, they realize that they can vote. They're a very good workforce. They show up for work, and they come to work, and there's very marvelous things about that. But I think sometimes we should think about that, is what is blocking that, or why don't we think that? Because we all have a wonderful opportunity to be in America. I mean, it's a great country to be in, and we sometimes sit and think about that. And tragedies that happen in Orlando make us rethink of we're in a beautiful country, and we are able to walk about and be be about and oftentimes say anything we want, but I mean, we're allowed to do that. So I would just echo that we've had a very positive experience with refugees and encourage other people to think about that.
Maybe I can remind you, on the phone you said something I really liked about when you talked about how proud you were about Fargo and how you have a very high percentage of refugees welcomed, and how somebody told you got that backwards.
A reporter called me one morning and he said, "You understand you have one of the highest capitas in the state for having refugees." I expected me to say, "Oh my God, that's a problem." And I said, "Oh great, we ought to tell everybody that." And he said, "What?" I said, "Yeah, we should be proud of that. That's something we could be proud of as an area, as a welcoming city." And it threw him backwards a bit.
That's great to hear. Now let us open the floor to questions. Please state your name and affiliation, and somebody will come and get you a mic. Maybe the lady right here.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Kathy Dennis, and I'm with the International Association for Volunteer Effort. One of the things I'm really interested in is the labels that we all used here. And I'm just wondering, when does the label change? When does it change externally? When does it change internally for the individual? We just did a forum in Europe on the refugee crisis and what companies were doing to try to support refugees coming into their countries and into their communities. And that labeling is still a challenge. It's a huge challenge in Europe. And they kept talking about the refugee camps and not having that and how important integration is. And I think that's something I'm proud about that we do. We don't put people into camps. We try to integrate. But the labeling is something that I'm just want to try to understand more.
Would you like one of you?
Wait.
Well, I think he used the labels, the mayor used the labels the right way. I mean, they are new Americans. But go ahead, Dave.
Do you mean why we call them refugees? Is that?
Well, I mean, somebody comes in, they're a refugee. How long, in some cases, it feels like a trap. You come in, you're labeled a refugee. Yes, you have all these great services that are provided for you, but it's like, when can you shake that? One of the reasons I say that is that one of the speakers we had in the forum in Europe was a young woman who was from Croatia. Well, she was from Bosnia originally, but now she's in Croatia. And she said to us, "Thank you for giving me this opportunity to view my refugee past in a positive way." And that just struck me because I thought, wow, what does that mean?
So I will say, I think it's quite different, the situation in how they're considered in Europe. I think in America, we do fairly quickly not call people refugees. How they get treated in the community may also be, even if you're not a refugee from Somalia, you might be treated as a refugee, or you might be considered a refugee because, because that's how people make the associations. I would say in the data, in fact, it's hard for us to do that partly because of that we don't ask those questions and we don't make those labels always. We thought it was interesting in this report to say, we do want to know something, though, about what happens to people over the longer term. So I'm not eager to say that, these people are refugees and still refugees. Almost all of them, in fact, are either legal permanent residents or have become citizens. But it's also, I think, worthwhile to know how they're doing. It's true that part of the reason we're looking at it is because, not so much because of how are they doing in themselves, although we're interested in that. It's the question of what about the newcomers and what's going to happen to them? Can we, how do we make any kind of conclusions about what we can expect in the next 5 or 10 or 20 years? And to do that, we kind of we thought we needed to go back and look at it that way.
I think that's a great comment, because I was introduced to somebody one day and he said, "He's a refugee, Tim." And this person turned to me and said, "Well, Tim, I've been here 19 years. So it's kind of like, okay, I don't think you're a refugee, you're a new American. But, yeah.
I would just add that I think overseas, whenever there is a refugee situation, refugees immediately go to the neighboring country, right? In any of these developing countries, the neighboring country usually has had some sort of border war with you at some point, And so you really are unwelcome. You really are disliked. When I've been overseas and talked to our refugee community workers where we work, and I tell them, "Do you know what Google is?" And they all say, "Of course." And I said, "Well, the guy who created Google was a refugee. Do you know what WhatsApp is?" "Of course, I'm using it now." the guy who created WhatsApp was a refugee, and they feel good about who they are, but you're forced to feel embarrassed. I actually was in Bosnia and Croatia at the time. I was running the US program to bring Bosnians in, and so I know what you're talking about. The Bosnians who came to Croatia felt very dirty, very bad, very guilty, and so that happens. But I think the good thing is that in America, as you're both saying, that's not what we have done, and hopefully that's not what we will do, but it feels like we're going in that direction.
We are out of time here, so if
Okay.